Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a very special guest with us tonight. We have Dr. Phil Capin, and Dr. Phil is the lead researcher on the article that we will be discussing tonight called Reading Comprehension Instruction, Evaluating Our Progress Since Durkin's Seminal Study. And he led a group of, I believe, 11 researchers. Is that correct? Were there 11? Yes. And, it's a huge study and a lot of people are buzzing about it. We just recently had an interview with Trina Spencer and Doug Peterson, where they emphasized the language piece. We want to know from you, Phil, how does your research align with the whole language comprehension part? And so you mentioned a lot of things that were important, that were evidence-based, that are not being followed in the classroom necessarily based on what you saw. So what part does language comprehension have in this? Is it everything? Is it the whole enchilada? Is it one piece of it? Could you explain it? Because as practitioners, lots of people are confused right now. There's been an emphasis on knowledge building. We all know that knowledge building is very important. At the same time, it certainly is one strand of comprehension, and there are other pieces of the puzzle. We've been very good, as you mentioned, teaching decoding. At least now, many teachers have gotten better at it, and it's been emphasized in the science of reading. So where does all this fit in? We want to hear from you, and then Judy and I will have some questions based on your research. And we hope that practitioners out there will walk away maybe having a sense of what to do based on some of your advice.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. So I think you started with a really broad and important question. What is the role of language in reading comprehension? And clearly, language is inextricably linked to written understanding of text. And so, if you think of the simple view of reading, you have what now we refer to as word recognition. Originally, Goff and Tubman referred to it as decoding. And then you have linguistic comprehension, or they refer to it originally as listening comprehension, but now we generally refer to it as language comprehension. And the product of that is reading comprehension. So right there, in the simple view of reading, very clearly you see that language comprehension is critical to reading comprehension. It is sort of the oral correlate of written text, right? And so some people have thought, the simple view of reading, you see these two circles, you see word recognition and language comprehension, you think they might be of equal importance, right? And we know that's not exactly true. In the early grades, word recognition plays a really fundamental role and explains most of the variance in reading comprehension. When you're reading a basic text, particularly like a decodable text or a more constrained text in first grade, your ability to read the words is going to be pretty closely related to your comprehension. But as students get older, we know that language comprehension really controls for the variance in reading comprehension. Much more of it, right? Students are in 5th grade, 6th grade, they're reading complex texts. Those complex texts have significant vocabulary demands. There's syntactical structures that are difficult for students to follow. And then it really draws on knowledge, right? And so, if you hear people say that language is really key to reading comprehension, it's true, right? I mean, it's definitely true. And in that way, reading comprehension sort of begins at birth. It begins with language development that occurs even before you start working with texts. Now, you could also think, you brought up the knowledge part, right? Well, how do you communicate knowledge? It's through language, right? So these things are sort of two sides of the same coin. And so you have people, I think, that are rightly pushing on the importance of knowledge building. which, as kids get older, word recognition, unless you're a really struggling reader, it doesn't play that larger role in your ability to understand text. Language comprehension does, right? But within language comprehension, knowledge and vocabulary are the strongest correlates to reading comprehension as students get older. And so, sometimes I've talked to Hugh Katz about this, and sometimes we refer to it as like the important role of language, and then other times we'll talk about the important role of knowledge. But what we're talking about is the same thing, right? We're talking about students' abilities to know things about the words and about the world, and that's communicated through language, and it accumulates in knowledge. Yeah, so is that helpful, Faith, to sort of think about the role of language?
It is. I think people need to see the big picture. And even though we have the reading rope and we've seen it a million times, I still think that there is some confusion because knowledge building has taken center stage, where I think that people feel that if you buy a certain program, they have their curriculum set for them, and the strategy piece has been lost in that, even though they'll say that strategies are taught, but it has taken a back seat. So we kind of, as teachers, want to know what to do. So Judy Boxer, my co-host, is in a building right now working with teachers, and she looks to have answers for those teachers and wants to clearly understand what the message should be. And she is working with a core curriculum right now. And many times there are questions that come up on our show where, it's not a clear, direct path to what teachers practically can utilize from this.
Yeah.
So Judy, I'm going to ask you to jump in right now. What are some of your thoughts after our last conversation that we had? And now that we have Dr. Capin with us, what are some thoughts you have right now that maybe you're a little confused about, or what you think maybe our audience is confused about based on some of the responses?
All right, so it's been very interesting diving deeper into comprehension. I think that, my comfort level has always been, for the last couple of years, the phonics episodes, the decoding episodes, cracking the code. That came very naturally to me. I've gotten so much training in that. I feel really good about what I'm doing in that aspect. Now, in terms of comprehension, I think for a very long time, many schools got it wrong. I myself was in a balanced literacy building in Brooklyn, New York for 15 years as a classroom teacher. And we were following a very TC, balanced literacy model where we thought we were doing comprehension well. But what that looked like was really a lot of asking questions, maybe a little bit of showing that metacognition piece, but not enough focus on it. What happens in the story? What was the problem in the story? What was the solution in the story? Oh, what do you think the character felt? Oh, did you ever have a day that you felt like that character? It was just a lot of asking questions, not a lot of strategy work. There was knowledge building, I would say, but I don't think that, my training and comprehension back in the days when I was a classroom teacher was that strong. Then I was in reading recovery. We definitely did not do a lot of training in comprehension. The training that I got in comprehension was a lot of, let's do a picture walk. Let's do a sneak peek. Let's do, just building a lot of vocabulary, which we know is helpful to students and so forth, and so forth, but also not a lot of strong practice. Now in my structured literacy days, I think that, I've gone through some workshops in terms of comprehension. I'm very well trained by Anita Archer. She came to a lot of my PDs, and, I know what the explicit model looks like, what an explicit teach looks like, and so forth. But I really want to get down to the nitty gritty now that, I have focused so much on those strings that focused on decoding and, vocabulary and different pieces, but how do I integrate that all into my classroom to make sure that, my comprehension instruction is stellar? I mean, we just had an episode with Trina and Doug. It was fascinating. They talked about many things that I'm not that familiar with. My DMs blew up. I got so many messages from teachers that were excited. They thought the episode was interesting, but many of my listeners walked away, just as not puzzled, but curious and maybe puzzled on what are our next steps as classroom practitioners to make sure that we get the comprehension piece right. I know that language is important. That's always been a big part of my classroom, but how do I take it to the next level, Phil?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just make a few points. I think one thing that, I think one thing we should maybe be clear about is that I think oral language and written language are different. When you look at written text, it's not just oral language written down. And so, there's written text, and reading comprehension requires, higher levels of vocabulary, more sophisticated language. And so I think that, we should certainly, have more language. I think a big part of the study that maybe led you to talk to me is one of the major findings is that classroom discussion about text often follows an initiate, respond, evaluate interaction pattern. And what that means is that a teacher is sort of leading the dance about the conversation about a text, and that they'll initiate a question, and then the student will provide a short response, and then the teacher will evaluate that response, right? And I think this conversational pattern doesn't develop the type of language, nor does it engage students in taking on the task of understanding text comprehension very well. And so, I think that, a language-focused approach to supporting reading comprehension is critical. But I also think that, just in the same way that I think I'm a fan of focusing on knowledge. And I think that our curriculum should be organized to systematically develop students' knowledge. I think both of you, my training is actually primarily in early reading. I was taught as sort of a dyslexia teacher, and I learned, how to teach students to learn to read pretty well. But I wasn't really trained to help students to comprehend text. I didn't really understand how to, use talk moves to elaborate on students' language, to recast statements that weren't fully articulated. I didn't have this sort of language training. And so I do think that language is a big part of it, and that we need to have better discussions about text for sure. But I also think that just as you can't, we can't just say, okay, now we're going to focus on knowledge. And Natalie Wexler's not suggesting this. I don't think anyone really is suggesting this. But sometimes what people are suggesting is not how it gets interpreted, right? And so I just want to make sure we don't interpret the focus on knowledge to be like putting students to watch videos or to gain knowledge through PowerPoints, right? No one's suggesting that. And I think the same is true for the focus on language development. Language-focused reading comprehension approaches. So I'm working on a language-focused reading comprehension approach right now where, really crucial to supporting students' text comprehension is helping them to better understand narrative text and to understand the schemas, the story structures, and the episodic nature of those. And a lot of it is through discourse, right? But I'm not saying we take the text out of the equation, right? So we have to keep the text. And so I think if we keep that lens, that language is critical to reading comprehension, but that students still need to engage, of course, with text, then I'm all in favor of language-based approaches to supporting reading comprehension. I think Faith, your question was about how do we balance strategies and knowledge building, which I think is sort of the quintessential question of the last couple of years. And the way I'm thinking about it, and I'd be interested in hearing what you all think. But the way I'm thinking about it is that we have been really systematic, like in our dyslexia programs, about graphing phoneme correspondences, right? If you look at some of those programs, that are focused on, Orton Gillingham-based programs, they have a lot of expectancies or rules that they're teaching students, right? And then if you look within some of those same programs and you look at the ways in which they focus on text comprehension, it's not quite as thoughtful. I mean, I've worked on word reading programs and I've made these same choices. Even as a teacher, when I was focused on developing students' word reading, I was like, so systematic. I'm going to start with single syllable decoding. We'll start with CVC words. They're going to learn to read those words pretty well. Then they're going to get more complex, digraphs and all of this, right? But then I would go to read a text and I would just choose whatever text, right? And I didn't systematically build their knowledge. And so I do think we need to be more systematic about our knowledge building in these curricula that systematically and go deep into certain content areas, and that they spiral back to them. So, they return to the same topics in future years, expanding students' knowledge. I think that work is really important. But I don't think, and I don't see many people suggesting this, though I think some people interpreting the guidance as saying we should get rid of strategies. I think what Natalie Wexler and others, and what I agree with, is that they shouldn't be the focus of instruction. Your instruction should not be primarily focused on, main idea for a whole year, right? That you would incorporate strategies like asking and answering questions in the context of a knowledge building curricula. And that, would be, I think, a profitable way. And the last thing I'll say, because I realize I'm going on, is that I think, the extent to which students will need strategy instruction will really vary on the students you're serving. So, at home right now, I have 2 children. My 8-year-old is a pretty engaged reader. She has pretty strong foundational skills. And so for her, I don't need to spend a lot of time teaching her strategies because she learned them pretty easily. And, like many strong readers, seems to be highly engaged in text and apply strategies as needed. But I have another child who I think might need a little bit more support. And in a classroom of students, we see this all the time, right? And so I think when I'm thinking about balancing, knowledge building and strategies, I'm not thinking of them in conflict. I'm thinking that I'm organizing my instruction to systematically develop knowledge, and that I'm not throwing out the comprehension strategies that have shown to help students. There's strong research to show that reading comprehension strategies are associated with improved outcomes. And there's theoretical grounding for this too, right? We know that students that are struggling readers, they have less background knowledge to draw from, and they're less successful in bringing to bear the knowledge that they have. And that's why the strategies can be helpful.
So here's my question. In your research article, it talks about the Durkin study, and that was 50 years ago. And from what it says in the study, you and the other researchers wrote that pretty much not much has changed in terms of what is happening in the classroom. So what's the issue then? If we have this research and it's not really working in the classroom, and from what was studied 50 years ago and now what's been studied now, nothing has really changed, or at least very little. How about that? Has really changed. Why? Why do teachers seem to just, as Judy said, ask comprehension questions, wait for a response, and then evaluate, rather than this idea of actually teaching how to really get through text and give these particular strategies and build knowledge? Why is this not getting into the classroom?
Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on the strategy knowledge conversation. Maybe we could return to that.
I would love to. I'm just itching. I'm sitting and I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about my study, but I would like, one of the findings of my study our study is that teachers, take a more monologic rather than dialogic approach to conversations. They're sort of teacher-led. And in this interview, it's dawning on me that, that's not what we want. We want people engaged in conversation. And now, I'm answering your questions, and it's and it is more one-way communication. But I'll do that. I will follow the rules and answer the question about my study and maybe why we haven't seen the change.
There are no rules here. No rules. Now,
Well, I do want to know
literacy.
then, how are you balancing, the strategy versus knowledge building? Do you agree with some of the things I said, or the things you would change about that?
You could go first, Faith, and then I want to definitely chime in. I'm burning. I'm burning.
So here's my feeling. I definitely think it's important to build knowledge, but kids are going to come across books where they don't have the knowledge of that particular topic. And teachers are going to have to build knowledge, even if it's not part of a set curriculum. And, there are some programs where they spend months really going very deep into topics, but then they could be given something else and they're still at square one because they don't have that background knowledge. And it's kind of impossible to build background knowledge on every topic they're going to come across. So where I am listening, and I agree that it's very helpful if you have this deep knowledge when you start to read something. Sometimes teachers have to build knowledge on the spot because the kids are being given books that they don't have that set curriculum for. So, as I'm listening, that's something that's going on in my mind. But I also think part of the problem is that this research is not really understood well enough by the teachers, or the message is not being sent in a powerful way where people truly understand what to do with it. That's what I think. Your thoughts?
Judy, I know you wanted to get in. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Faith that we definitely cannot cover every topic. And what's frustrating about a lot of these programs is they're just assuming what's important knowledge for certain students, and that knowledge might not be very relevant to the students that I work with, whether it be where I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, or where I work in the South Bronx or in the Bronx area. So who determines what knowledge is important for students? And yes, there are things that every student should know, right? When I was growing up in the 80s, there were certain things that I knew. I knew which borough I lived in, and I knew which country I lived in, and so forth. But who determines what knowledge is important? The other thing that really bothers me is that some people are not in a classroom, they're not a researcher, that people just make statements. And I think that we have to be very careful because words are very important to me. And especially after my experience with my balanced literacy days and believing in something so strongly, now I really look to research and evidence. So it scares me when people just will go online, give their opinions, and people will idolize and worship people and think, oh my God, that person said that. That's it. This is written in stone and this is what I need to follow. That's really concerning for me. And I think it's a very dangerous thing, in fact. So I really believe that I want to follow evidence. And, I've heard that people say, okay, yes, there's not that much evidence yet that a knowledge building curriculum is going to shift the needle, but it's an emergency to take that information because if we don't, kids might lose out. But that's the same theory that we went on with balanced literacy, where we didn't follow research and evidence. And look where that got us. We have a generation of students that can't really read that well. So I feel an obligation to really follow evidence. And yes, I know knowledge is important. Listen, I'm presenting a PD on shared reading and using certain texts tomorrow. And day one of my shared reading plan that I'm presenting is knowledge building, and it is building vocabulary and so forth. That's important, but I strongly, strongly know, based on working with kids, and maybe I'm wrong, right? I don't know, because I don't, nobody's studying Judy's work. That strategy work is really important. And for me, it aligns directly with what explicit teaching is, right? I need to show you how to do something. Let's practice it together. Now go do it independently. Very many kids have no idea, even if they have knowledge, on how to do certain things. And let's be honest, yes, we're not just teaching to test, right? I saw kids take the state exams last week in English language arts. We're not just teaching to test, but when you look at those tests, they are asking things like central idea. And just because a kid knows a lot about bats doesn't mean that they necessarily know how to find the central idea in a passage. Or if the passage is about raccoons, yes, maybe they know that a raccoon is nocturnal. Maybe they know that, a raccoon can give you rabies, but they might not know different things that they're being asked. So I strongly feel that strategy instruction is a big part of structured literacy and what kids. And yes, Phil, I think you mentioned that your daughter came naturally, and that's great. 40% of kids reading comes naturally for them, but for many kids things don't come naturally, and I feel like we have an obligation as teachers to learn how to teach comprehension better and prioritize language. But I also feel like we need to equip our students on how to tackle different texts, especially on topics that they've never learned about. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's it.
No, and there's a lot of points of agreement with that. The example of my daughter I brought up to just say that I have two daughters, and one of them it came more easily, and the other one it doesn't seem to come as easily, and that sort of suggests that the way we teach, the best method for teaching, I think, should be influenced by the students we're serving, as you both know, right? And so I think I would probably take a strategy approach with all students, but for my older student who seems to, learning comes more easily, maybe wouldn't need to push in as much. But I think the points are really helpful here. So I think, Faith, your main points were that you can't teach all the knowledge that students need to know. And so your teachers are going to have to, teach before reading knowledge, right? And I think that's very true. I think meta-analyses show that, before reading, instruction, so instruction that occurs before reading that focuses on building knowledge is associated with improved outcomes, right? Because there's text that the writer assumes the reader has some level of information about, right? That's how you write, right? You always assume the reader has some information. And for some students, they may not bring that information to bear. And so I agree. I don't think, organizing our curriculum around knowledge building more systematically is going to be a silver bullet, because you're right. You're not going to be able to teach everything that students need to know. And there's many times you'll have to, build knowledge beforehand. And the goal is to help students to read all sorts of different texts, right? And I think to do that, those practices that will influence your comprehension across domains will be very helpful, right? And so, some certain strategies I think can be very helpful. And so, yeah, and then Judy, your points around, following the evidence is really critical. And then who gets to choose the knowledge? So I think, most of Natalie Wexler's work and a lot of the work around knowledge building has stemmed from E.D. Hirsch's work. And that was the major criticism at the time of E.D. Hirsch's work is, who gets to choose what the core knowledge is, right? And I think there are fundamental questions there that, we have to all grapple with. For me, like I've been working on this social studies curriculum that was originally developed by another set of researchers, and it focuses on world history. And we worked on it to make it more stronger for English learners. So I worked with colleagues Sharon Vaughn and Letty Martinez at the University of Texas on this. And one of the key things is, the standards are they have to learn about ancient civilizations, right? In I think 6th grade world history. But when you're serving multilingual learners in an inner city community, how can you make sure that this feels really relevant and interesting to them, right? And so I think there are ways to do that. And in the curriculum, we sort of think about creating connections to present day. And so I think those are all important things. But I guess the main point I would make here, and I think that maybe we can sort of have some consensus about, is you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose knowledge or strategies. And that, knowledge building curriculum, it doesn't tell you what to teach. It just it tells you kind of what to teach, excuse me, but it doesn't tell you how to teach it, right? And so, reading comprehension strategies, I think, are an important part of the how to teach that knowledge, right? And so if you look at like some of the best work, I think, around knowledge building is by Jimmy Kim, who's a colleague. So I'm a little biased, but his work is, over multiple years, he builds the students' knowledge of social studies and science concepts, right? And a lot of people interpret this as evidence of knowledge building, which I think it is. But I think it's also should be interpreted as evidence of the vocabulary and instruction that is really at the center of his program called MORE. And so, if both of you are feeling like, oh, knowledge building curriculum are not a silver bullet, I agree. If you're also feeling like, just choosing the topics that we teach is not enough, I agree as well, right? That we have to, develop students' strategic thinking about text. We have to help them to slow down and to have interesting conversations about text. And to grapple with the complex ideas. And I think strategies are an important part of that. And for struggling readers, it's I think a necessary part is to help them to be actively engaged with text.
So here's what I'm thinking. As I'm listening, and I read the research, you also mentioned science and social studies time in classes. That was observed as well. What did you notice about when teachers were teaching these content area subjects? I could tell you as a classroom teacher, we were not given really, great models for how to teach those subjects. And I think teachers, at least years ago, they were given textbooks. Now I don't think they use textbooks very often, but we were given textbooks and they had lab time for science. And we were given maps, and basically we had to piece together our own way to teach those subjects. And now this is being woven into a knowledge building curriculum, right? Where is there a need to have separate science and social studies time? Because if so, why are we not focused, let's say, on science and social studies, building that piece up, teaching that well, and having these strategies go across the day, rather than just being given an ELA program and where it's expected that those subjects will be part of it. So I think here's the confusion, Phil. Nobody really gives the answer. They're buying a program, but nobody is really utilizing the research well. At least that's what it appears to me, especially when you look at the results.
And the other thing, Faith, is that we're also, a lot of schools board programs that, they have elements of science of reading and so forth, but they don't really have that much evidence behind them. I know you mentioned E.D. Hirsch and Core Knowledge. That program wasn't one of the choices in New York City schools. And I heard that one had some evidence, but the ones that were chosen in New York City, there's not like extensive evidence that says that they actually work, which makes it even harder for somebody like me as a practitioner to have full belief that it's going to give us the results that we want, which makes me believe that we have to really arm our teachers with, strong pedagogy in order to really shift outcomes.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right that, we know a lot less about specific programs and a lot more about evidence-based practices. And so, most of the curriculum that are out there have not been tested. And I think you're also right to wonder about the effects of knowledge building curricula, because that data is still emerging. There was a study by Sonia Cabell and colleagues on CKLA, which found that there were some improvements yielded by that program. And then, I referenced some of Jimmy Kim's work, which I think is really strong and rigorous, and suggests that organized instruction and a focus on vocabulary and building knowledge is essential. But you're right. I think that there's no quick fixes here, and this is a big problem domain. I mean, it's more challenging to improve reading comprehension than I think it is word reading. So maybe I could tell you a bit about what my study found, and then I could share some of what we learned in this process, and maybe the ways in which we're trying to improve reading comprehension instruction. Would that be helpful? So our study was a review of prior observation studies. So Durkin did this seminal observation study, as you noted, Faith, like 50 years ago. And in that study, she looked at, I think it was grades 3 and 6, and teachers in grades 3 and 6, and their ELA instruction and their social studies instruction. And she tried to understand to what extent were teachers supporting reading comprehension. And her conclusion was that teachers were not spending very much time teaching reading comprehension. Instead, they were assessing it. And what did she call reading comprehension assessment? Well, she referred to reading comprehension assessment as worksheets that would be considered reading comprehension assessment, or asking questions of students in that sort of interaction pattern that I described earlier. And so if a teacher was doing something to learn is whether a student understood a text, she considered that assessment, right? Now, I think it gets a little blurry here, because when you're providing instruction to a student after they've read a text and you want to support comprehension, we all ask literal questions, right? You need to ask literal questions to sort of check for understanding, and then you hopefully will be able to ask more open-ended and inferential questions. And so I think, we can wonder about this distinction she drew between assessment and instruction. But generally, I think there's pretty widespread agreement within the field that the initiate, respond, evaluation, interaction patterns don't represent the high quality discourse about text that we'd like to see in our classrooms, right? We want to see students talking with each other and talking with the teacher, and having prolonged discussions. And so our study was sort of, what is the state of the research? And we reviewed a bunch of other people's observation studies. I mean, some of the members of our team, like myself, had published observation studies, but we were reviewing the body of it, which is a bad idea. I'll just tell you, like trying to summarize a corpus of studies that's really diverse, because you can imagine some of these studies were interested in like strategy instruction, and others were interested in early reading, but how do you support comprehension in that context? And so it's a really diverse set of studies. But ultimately, what we found were a few themes emerged. One theme is that sometimes there is limited time spent on reading comprehension. And I think, one of the reasons that authors cited that there was less time spent on reading comprehension was because many students had difficulties reading complex texts. And so, we all see this in the field, right? Teachers report to us all the time that, it's difficult to engage students in 5th grade in a complex grade level text because they have trouble reading the words off the page, right? And so, and maybe one big idea, or I don't know if it's a big idea, but important idea, whenever we're talking about reading comprehension, I think the single most important thing you could do to improve reading comprehension is to make sure students develop foundational reading skills. And, that has to happen through structured literacy, which, Faith at the outset, mentioned that there's been a lot of emphasis on that. I still think, our practice in that area could improve. I think still teachers are grappling with how to provide high quality structured literacy instruction, but I think, clearly a lot of attention on it. And so that was one of the findings, is that teachers, that teachers were not spending very much time on reading comprehension. Part of it is, one of the reasons for that, I think, is because students have difficulty engaging with grade level text. I also think that, sometimes teachers are focused on reading very short snippets of text and not extended, text. And I think that makes it difficult to engage in rich discussion. The second finding.
Oh my God,
is that-
Faith. Can you
Oh.
take out your cheers button? Because what Phil said is so important that those short excerpts make it very hard to go deep into the comprehension skills. And Phil, that's a big problem that I'm seeing in the field is a lot of these programs that have been developed don't really go deep into reading long, rich texts. There's tons of excerpt stuff, and the kids aren't doing a lot of reading, and that's been problematic.
Yeah. And then the other major finding is that there's this gap between what's recommended. So, the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the arm of the Department of Education. I know you all know this. I'm just sharing it in case there's viewers that don't. But, the What Works Clearinghouse has practice guides about, what are recommended practices. And I think it's one of the great functions of the Institute of Education Sciences, which is currently facing major stress from federal changes, are these practice guides. And those practice guides, make recommendations for, engaging students in high quality discussions of text, building vocabulary knowledge, teaching reading comprehension strategies. And so we coded these studies to see to what extent were these practices occurring. And what you see is that they're not happening as often as you'd like. So, the considerable time spent on these discourse patterns that are not very strong is one thing. Another thing is when teachers are focused on strategies, sometimes they're not helping students to understand the conditional knowledge you need to enact the strategy. And so a big part of reading comprehension strategy instruction, as you know, is not just asking students to find the main idea or to ask and answer questions. It's helping them to understand with what text and under what conditions should you apply this strategy. A strategy like main idea makes sense if the text sort of aligns with that. But if it's a narrative text, narratives don't usually have a main idea, right? Like to understand a narrative text, you want to understand there's characters and that there's some goal-directed actions that sort of occur within the story. And so another finding from our study was that a comprehension strategy instruction does not appear to be implemented in the ways that it's recommended. And so I think those are some of the big findings. Limited time spent on reading comprehension, particularly in some grades. But I will say that more recently we're seeing more time spent on reading comprehension. And I would say that some of the most evidence-based practices were not being applied. So high quality discussions of text were not reported, and high quality comprehension strategy instruction is another thing that was sort of lacking. And I don't want to, I was a former teacher, my wife's a public educator. This is not to say that teachers are not doing a great job. I think it's more to say that we haven't yet helped teachers enough to provide high quality reading comprehension instruction.
And I would agree with you. But now a lot of school districts bought into the idea that if they throw out their guided reading, teachers college type of instruction, and they buy in to a new program, that it's going to be better. And yet, I'm not sure if it's any better, because a lot of these programs leave a lot of, unknowns. And it doesn't mean that the teacher is any better trained to handle this new program. And I think that it's going to be a few years before they could use this material the right way. And I think that goes back to teacher knowledge, that you can't just plop a program into a school and think that that's going to be the answer, that it really is on making sure the teacher knows how to use the program well, and the importance of how to teach strategies well, and which ones to use at the right time, and for children to be able to recognize on their own how to apply it. So there are a lot of factors here that I think that school district leaders and building leaders are under the impression that just buying a certain program might be the answer at that point, and maybe it's not. And I think over time we're going to have to see how teachers really use this. I don't know, Judy. What are some of your thoughts?
I have like 7,544 questions. So my first question is, what do we do next? Like, what do we do next? Us classroom teachers, people that are still providing AIS, small group instruction, whole group instruction, what do we do if we don't feel as well equipped as we should be? What do we do? What do we do? That's my first question.
And Phil, before you answer, I want to jump on what Judy just said. What do you do, whether you still have guided reading, because some school districts still have not made any sort of change, and what do you do if you now have a new program and
some of these new programs, if I just want to add, will do a skill a day keeps the doctor away.
Yeah. And
seriously, like today I'm doing character traits, tomorrow I'm doing main idea, then the next day I'm doing central idea, then the next day I'm doing synthesize, then the next day I'm doing
new program.
monitor and clarify, and then the next day I'm doing character traits again, and then the next day I'm doing synthesize again, and then I'm going back to main idea.
So you got the idea, Phil, that it's not so simple, and yet, as Judy said before, there are people who have a lot of opinions about this, and they're not the ones in the classroom dealing with these confusing messages. And I have teachers writing to me also privately. What do I do next? I feel defeated. We have this program, and yet I don't think it's strong enough in X, Y, and Z. And I really don't know what to do next.
So, and those teachers are coming on the air on May 27th. We're having a whole panel of teachers that are very emotional about this topic. So that's the first one. And then Faith, right after that one, I have one more for him based on the last episode. I want to dive into that oral reading fluency retail conversation.
Good point. I would like to do that too.
Well, you've asked a really easy question. How do we solve this problem? I think, I'll start with Judy's question and then try to integrate, your sort of nuance to it, Faith. I think that, I would just, I think I'm like you, I'm very skeptical that any program is going to lead to high quality reading comprehension instruction. I just think that it's reading, I guess at a very basic level, I think, what do we mean by reading comprehension? And is it something that we can teach? And so if we define reading comprehension as extracting and constructing meaning from text, and we know that the ability to extract and construct, which involves bringing in your prior knowledge, is going to differ across different areas, it's a big problem space to address, and it's also one that is, I would say, domain specific. So even if you do address it in the context of narratives, which I'm really interested in, I think you'll improve narrative comprehension to some degree. But then when they get to a science text, it's going to be different, right? And so I guess I'm going to make 4 recommendations. I don't know what they are yet, but I'm going to put them out there because I feel like, Judy, you're going to respond well if I'm like pretty concrete. And so I think one thing that I would recommend is that we're all really clear on what reading comprehension is and what it isn't. And I think that it's a domain. I'm persuaded by Hugh Katz and others who say that it's a domain-specific ability. That's not to say that there's not processes that underline all reading comprehension, like your metacognitive skills, your ability to evaluate whether you're understanding a text and to be interested in rereading or use some strategies, that will apply across domains, right? But just because you can understand something in a narrative text doesn't mean you're going to understand a social studies text and a science text, right? There's differences across these disciplines, not only in the knowledge you need to bring to bear, but also in the goals. In social studies, one of the goals is to understand different perspectives and to understand sourcing. And that takes sort of a critical lens that you need to bring to bear on that. It's different than what you need in science. And so I guess one thing is to be really clear on what reading comprehension is, because I think I'm still sort of coming to terms with what it is. And I think a lot of teachers are having trouble with this. Like, what is reading comprehension ability? Is it something I can directly teach, just like, phonics or phonemic awareness? Or is it the byproduct of a lot of other things that you can teach? And I'm kind of in the camp that I think it's more of a byproduct. We can certainly support it, and we can provide instruction in things that really relate to it. But I'm not sure it's something we can directly teach. The parallel I would draw is like entrepreneurship. Like, can you teach entrepreneurship? I don't know. I mean, I really don't know, because I don't know anything about business. But I don't think I bet you probably can't, because it takes like a mindset. It also takes the ability, willingness to take risk. You also have to understand businesses. So you certainly need knowledge and other things. But I think there are, the point I'm trying to make is that, like entrepreneurship, I think reading comprehension is not a single domain that can be explicitly taught in a class, and that you need to gain experiences with. And I think that's an important thing. And then, what do we do, Judy, to sort of improve reading comprehension instruction right away? I think there's a few things that I would say. So one is that, you just can't understand a text if you cannot read the words. And so all of our efforts on early reading, preventing reading difficulties, are crucial to reading comprehension. The maybe third point I'll make is that I think that we do need to support students in being active and purposeful in reading complex texts. And so I think the way in which we do that can be, through strategies, by making connections, making sure texts are made relevant to students' lives. I think that strategy instruction is an important part of helping students who are not actively engaged in text. I mean, we've all worked with those students, right? They're reading along and they make a mistake or something doesn't make sense, and they just keep humming along, right? And for those students, they're not actively engaged. They need some metacognitive supports to ensure that they're thinking about the reading process and not just trying to rush through it, but instead, trying to seek out meaning. And so I think strategies are an important part of that. I also think an important part of that is engaging students in like purposeful reading tasks. And so, the goal of reading, we often say is reading comprehension, but really it's to learn, right? Like I read, novels because they entertain me. I read, texts about reading because, I want to learn more about the latest research. And so I think, engaging students in complex and purposeful reading is really important. So that's my third thing. And maybe the fourth thing would be, I think that collaborative learning opportunities, that it can't just be me, the teacher, at the front of the room doing all of the work. So often when I was a teacher, I did this. I stood at the front of the room, I read the text aloud, then I would sometimes paraphrase it, and then I would ask them questions to check for understanding. And who's doing all the work? Me. And I'm like, I'm a proficient reader. I'm not the one that needs this, right? And so I do think that when I got better at, engaging students in collaborative learning to facilitate discussions, and engage, help students. I taught them strategies, I taught them supports, I built background knowledge before reading faith. I did all those things, and then I did give them opportunities for guided practice, working in collaborative learning. And getting back to the discussion about curricula, I don't think curricula is going to ever specify all of those things. Like, is it going to specify how to make it relevant to every kid's life? I don't think a curricula could do that. Is it going to tell you how to engage students in collaborative learning? I'm not sure it is, right? Is it going to help a teacher to lead a high quality discussion? A lot of that is responsive teaching, thinking on your feet, understanding what your students understand, what they don't, providing corrective feedback. And so I guess maybe I sense your skepticism about the knowledge building curricula, and I guess I apply it to all the curricula. You know, I'm not aware of any curriculum that I've really found that I thought was, you know, I could just plug and play that and it would teach a classroom of students how to read and understand.
So let's go back to what Judy mentioned, ORF, oral reading fluency.
Wait. So I would just want to hear your comments on that though. Do you
Comment.
do you feel like I'm on the right track with that, or are there things you would change?
I think you're on the right track, Phil. I think you're definitely on the right track, but I also think that there's like maybe some misunderstanding about how I don't want to speak for Faith, but how I feel about knowledge building. I do feel it's crucial, but I just feel like,
we'll agree for sure.
I just feel like it's just become like two camps.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, like there was the balanced literacy camp and the science of reading camp. And now I feel like there's the knowledge building camp and the strategy building camp. And I'm not part of any camp. And I think that they're both a critical piece of making sure that kids understand, because I think meaning is the core of why we teach kids how to read. And we know that we didn't attend to teaching decoding enough, but now I think that we need to prioritize this strand just as much. But I think that people are so caught up in just, you know, possibly even hidden agendas. You know, I think that there's people that, you know, are attached to beliefs. I think that there's people that are looking to fill their pockets. And, you know, for somebody like me and many other people, we're just looking to help kids. And I think that there's so many critical pieces that need to come into play. And I think that it's a very dangerous conversation when you know, will go on X in the morning and you'll hear people saying, no, this is the way. No, this is the way, whether it be, you know, the strategy folks or the knowledge building folks. And I find it to be completely frustrating. Like, it's frustrating.
What I was thinking. So what I was hearing when you were describing what's important, to me, it sounded like that collaborative learning and the discussion all goes back to language. Maybe it didn't, you know, that's what it sounds like to me, that if you can't teach it and it's not going to be in the curriculum, the only way to really build that up is through modeling language and building children's language so that they can participate in these types of discussions, because otherwise they're going to give you one-word answers. And that's going to write it down as just phrases. They're not going to really
and moving away from those simplistic, just like quick turn and talks that are like 3 seconds.
That's correct.
That are not like those deeper conversations. And I think, you know, I think Phil made another important point about, you know, moving away from being a fully teacher-led lesson where the teacher's doing all the heavy lifting. Phil mentioned that, you know, part of teaching comprehension was realizing I, as the teacher, know how to do this. How do I make sure that the kids can engage in these deeper discussions and so forth?
Well, here's what my thinking was, Judy. In doing that, the teacher is doing the heavy lifting often because the kids don't have the language to do the heavy lifting. They really don't know how to put ideas together or to write their.
Do you think that's always the case, Faith? I think sometimes the kids do have the ability, but it's the teacher not being able to give up control. I remember being a classroom teacher in my earlier days, and I don't see myself as a controlling person, but I did spend a lot of time talking.
I think you spent a lot of time talking, and probably it was heavily led by the teacher, because if you turned it over to the students, you wouldn't get a lot out of them. Often,
I don't know if I agree with that. I'm going to have to challenge you on that.
Okay.
One.
So I could tell you that kids will do turn and talk, but if it's not where the teacher is very clear about building the language, you will come out with very simplistic or off the task type of responses. And I've seen it. I've seen it often where the kids are left on their own to do things, and then they end up talking about something else, or they stick to very simplistic types of things and they don't go into the text. And I think a lot of that does go back to their language and not having enough language to know how to tackle this. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, let me just share a couple examples. I think that, there's lots of ways to do classroom discussion or turn-in talks that are a complete waste of time, right? It needs to be really highly structured. And so let me provide two curriculum examples, because I think they'll sort of explain the way that I think this can be done effectively, because I've been talking at a very high level, I think, about the way we can engage in discourse, but maybe these examples. So one is collaborative strategic reading. So that was developed 25 years ago by Jeanette Klingner.
I used it. I just want to interrupt you. I've used that. And there are people on Twitter who they don't teach and they haven't used it. I've used collaborative strategic reading, but that
we gotta get
is guided by a teacher who knows how to use it. You have
All right, so Phil, tell us more. I want to hear the nitty-gritty.
So, I think we got to get rid of this, at least between the three of us. We can't control Twitter, but between the three of us, I think we just got to try to avoid. I didn't even know there's these two camps, Judy. I just tried to do research and not stay off social media. But we gotta get rid of this false dichotomy that it's either knowledge or strategies. I mean, you see false dichotomies all the time in reading. It's like we either have to develop language. You see this in whole language perspectives, or we can teach phonics, but God forbid we could do both. And we know, that we can, right? And so we got to get rid of that. So for collaborative strategic reading, what's interesting about that program is that it was developed by Klingner and Vaughn in response to upper elementary grade teachers who were having difficulty engaging their students in complex texts. And so, what Jeanette and Sharon did is they developed a program that didn't include text. The idea was that teachers could maintain their focus on the text that their units cover, right? But there would be these 10 model lessons, or 10 or 11 model lessons, that would teach students to carry out these cooperative learning practices. So collaborative is the cooperative, so they're working in groups. The strategic is the strategies, right, that they apply. These are comprehension strategies that help students to develop their metacognition and to engage with complex texts, right? And so I think that program is really highly structured. Each student is assigned a role. There's heterogeneous groupings, and so I think there are ways to do this where it can be highly effective, right? Another example is I've been working with this social studies curriculum that I was telling you about earlier. And that program, it originally was developed by SERP, the Strategic Educational Research Partnership. And it was developed by Catherine Snow and Suzanne Donovan and colleagues. And the program, they called it SoGen. We made some revisions to it, and it's freely available. And I think it's a high quality curriculum or a set of materials. And that program, it organizes a unit of social studies instruction around a dilemma. So you can imagine, one of the dilemmas is, were the ancient pharaohs wise or wasteful? And so it's sort of an interesting question that they have to debate, and then they read text. And the way it brings in the collaborative learning is that it builds to a debate. And so these middle school students, engage with texts about the ancient pharaoh. Well, first they do a reader's theater. So they take on parts and they read a discussion among children that's on a topic related to the overall dilemma. And then, they work on learning about the ancient pharaohs, and then they learn about different perspectives, and then they have a debate and they do a persuasive essay. And in that, it's really highly structured, right? And students, it's amazing what they can do. These sixth graders, including in schools with a lot of English language learners, are really engaged in discussion and debate. And so I think, Faith, I think you're right that many times language and discussion in classrooms fall short. But I think I also agree with Judy. I'm trying to make sure you guys are still friends at the end of this. That Judy's right that they can and will do more if they're provided support and have that sort of optimized instruction. And those are two approaches that I think, at the core have that collaborative learning piece.
So going back to oral reading fluency, we want to know what.
Give him context, just in case you didn't
Yes,
see the
we
last episode.
know. We want to know your thoughts about oral reading fluency predicting comprehension. Is that an effective predictor of comprehension?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really my thought. It's well documented that oral reading fluency is highly associated with reading comprehension, particularly in the early grades. And so your ability, also oral reading fluency, the correct words per minute that you're able to read, is very highly correlated, with reading comprehension in the elementary grades. And now as you get older, it becomes less predictive. But it's still a bridge between word recognition and reading comprehension. You can't understand a text that you don't read fluently. That's well documented. It's also very difficult. Have you ever tried to read a text where you don't know what the words mean? Like even for me, if I was reading like a high-level medical textbook, I could probably sound out some of the words, but I don't know what they mean. I don't find the words very quickly. It's hard to read with fluency. And so even as kids get older, I think oral reading fluency is still, associated, though not as strongly, with reading comprehension. And so for that reason, I think there's good, it's well accepted that it's a good way to quickly, in 1 minute, take a student's temperature in reading.
So on our last episode, Trina and Doug mentioned that it was never compared to anything else as far as the fluency piece goes. That, if we look at retelling, that has a very strong connection when the kids are able to retell. The amount that they retell, the quality of their retelling in terms of what they understand, more so than an oral reading fluency measure. And that came up. So I think
But the oral reading fluency that I administer in my school is like they read a passage. We see how many words they read per minute.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
But right after we administer it, we do the retell. And what I was told prior to that episode from people that provide the screener is that there's a direct correlation on if a kid does well on the ORF in terms of reading it and also retelling it, they're very likely to do well on the state exams later on. Is that true? Not true? I thought that it was true.
Yeah. So maybe to Faith's first point about oral reading fluency not being compared to other measures, I've been a part of studies that have compared the predictive nature of oral reading fluency relative to other measures, and we find that it is quite predictive, like compared to a maze task, compared to a comprehension, a more more extensive reading comprehension task. And so I do think that it stands up. It's also efficient, right? And so it depends what your goal is. If your goal is just to screen students for reading difficulties, I think oral reading fluency is quite helpful, right? It's very quick, it's efficient. It does have to be individually administered, but it is a useful measure to take a student's temperature, right? It's not a diagnostic measure for sure. I mean, there are diagnostic information you can garner from it, but related to reading comprehension, I don't think you can ascertain, whether they're having trouble making inferences or whether they have limited background knowledge. And so there's certainly limits on it. But I think oral reading fluency is, a strong indicator of general reading achievement, particularly in the elementary grades. I think, very strong evidence of that. Related to retells, I guess retells are typically, talked about in the context of narratives. Oftentimes, you have a student retell a story in a narrative, and that provides really good, strong information about their comprehension of the story. And I think that it is a richer measure of narrative language and narrative comprehension, perhaps. But it's also, takes longer to do a retell, to some, depends on how you measure it, but there is some challenges there. In expository text, I'm not sure. I guess I'm not that familiar with summarizing is another measure, but you don't often see retells used in the context of expository texts. And so I guess my response to the question about oral reading fluency and retells, I think they kind of serve a different purpose, and retells makes a lot of sense in the context of narratives. But oral reading fluency, I think, is a strong initial indicator of reading comprehension.
Judy, do you have
Faith, was that the impression that you got from the last episode too?
I think we have to go a little bit deeper, but I think most teachers at this point would agree with what Phil is saying, that was always my understanding before we had that conversation. That's what we learned in reading first. That was something that we learned, that fluency is highly correlated with comprehension, especially.
For me too. That's what I learned too.
And then by 5th and 6th grade, this is what I was told, it starts to become not as highly correlated. Like, starts to wane a little bit. That's what I was
told. You got
told.
this, Faith. You're right.
But again, we're trying to really get answers and help teachers. And I do think that the language piece.
That's what I want to ask him about. I want to ask Phil about that. Phil, how do you feel about the necessity of bringing language screeners into our classroom, and also more extensive comprehension tools, especially in the elementary age? Do you think that's something that schools should be thinking about?
Yeah. And I don't want to be perceived as saying that retells are a bad idea. I'm actually using them in a study right now. And my wife's a speech language. She was a teacher, but now she's a speech language pathologist, and she would not be happy if she thought that I was being perceived as saying retells are a bad idea. I think they're quite useful, and actually as a good instructional practice too. When students identify the important parts of a story and then they retell, that retelling helps to consolidate their knowledge of a story. And so I think it's good for instruction and for assessment. But I don't think that says anything negative about oral reading fluency. About language, Judy, it's now 9:30 here, so you're gonna have to remind me. Oh, language screeners. So the language screening, I think, is critical. And I guess what I would say is that we often think about dyslexia in the context of reading disabilities, and there are many students that have dyslexia, that have difficulties emanating primarily from phonological difficulties. That manifest in word reading and spelling challenges, right? But neurodevelopmental disorders like dyslexia are often co-occur. And so if you're a student with dyslexia, you're at higher risk for ADHD. You're also at higher risk for language disorders. And so, a lot of my research is focused on this population, about supporting students with dyslexia. And in some of our work, we found that really high numbers of these students also have co-occurring language difficulties. Like when you're trying, the classic dyslexic, the student who has really strong oral language but has difficulty with the code. That is that there are certainly students like that. But if you go into schools, particularly in schools where there's students that have had less opportunities to engage with rich language at home and maybe in the classroom. And for those students, they often have word reading difficulties and they have broader language difficulties. And part of this is because there's some like ideological factors, like there's shared risk factors that influence both things. So like poor working memory, for instance, is going to influence both language and reading ability. And so there's these shared risk factors, right? But also, these things are reciprocal. Like if you don't read very much, your language is not going to be, grow as much. If your language is foundational to reading. And so I do think that screening, and like Tiffany Hogan has done a lot of work in this area. I do think that we should be screening. I think we made significant advances in reading screening, right? Over the last 20 years, the reading, the science of reading legislation, right, has really pushed for screening for dyslexia. And I do think we need to consider, significant attention also for language-based difficulties.
Dr. Phil Capin, we're going to wrap up. So are there any last thoughts that we did not cover with you that you want to share?
No, I mean, I guess the one thing I would share is that, I hope that we can, move away from this idea that we have to choose between, systematically developing knowledge, which I think we all agree is important, and strategies. And I think you're right that there have been times where people maybe haven't been as careful with their language, or there's been room for interpretation that would suggest that we're choosing one or the other. And I don't think that's the case. And I think we need to do all of these things. And I'm hopeful that your show and other shows like this can help teachers learn about it.
Thank you. We really
Thanks.
appreciate you joining us. This was a real pleasure having you, and we hope to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.